Oh, good. Okay. Did I bump it? Did I bump your cord? Oh, no. Oh, no. I'll try not to touch. All right. Hi, thanks so much for coming tonight. I'm delighted that you all are here because I was afraid that we didn't do a fantastic job at promoting, but are you here because you heard about it at the Sunday classes? Yes, but some, otherwise it looks like. Yay, glad you're here. A special welcome to those who are on live stream, who are joining us by live stream. I heard a number of people say, I'm going to stay home and watch it from home. See, this great technology is enabling people to do these events, not in the building, but we're glad about that anyway. For those who are live streaming at home, if you are tuning in from the on the YouTube channel, you can put questions in the chat during the question and answer time, and we will pick those up. So this is great. I am delighted to introduce Eric Smith, Reverend Dr. Eric Smith. He is not a stranger to Montview Church. We've had Eric here before, but it has been a few years. Eric has taught, I think the last time you were here, you were on Reformation Sunday and did those first hundreds of years of the early church. But tonight, Eric is with us doing How the New Testament Became White and How to Start Reading It Differently, which is going to be very compelling. Eric is the Assistant Professor of Early Christianity and Contemporary Christian Practices at Iliff School of Theology. He is also a pastor and knows what it's like to be a pastor. He pastored a few different churches for about 15 years, and Eric is currently at Plymouth Congregational Church in Inglewood as the teaching minister. He is an exceptional teacher, a great reputation around town, and his most recent book is called Paul the Progressive, ? The Compassionate Christian's Guide to Reclaiming the Apostle Paul as an Ally, which I love. So we'll look forward to having you, Eric, at another time do a series for us on that. Anyway, would you join me in welcoming Eric Smith and listen carefully, and we'll have a time of Q&A when he is finished. So.
Hello. How is everyone? Thank you so much for having me here. Thanks to all of you who are here, and thanks to those who have joined on the live stream. I know several people have told me that they're going to be on there watching from home, and so it's very flattering that you all made time in your days for this. In August of 2017, in Charlottesville, Virginia, at the Unite the Right rally being held as a demonstration of power by an alliance of white supremacist and white nationalist organizations, an amateur photographer captured this scene and posted it to Instagram. In the image, a black police officer stands vigilant in the foreground while a collection of rally participants mills about in the background. One man gives a Nazi salute. Others wear clothing with the logos and insignia of various extremist organizations. A man in Klan attire carries a flag, and furthest to the left of the image, another man, I think my mic just cut out, another man carries a Confederate flag in his right hand, and in his left, something that immediately caught my eye. A poster with the words, "Jews are Satan's children," in large letters, and below that, several citations from the New Testament. The first thing I did when I saw this image was to zoom in on the poster to make sure I was seeing what I thought I was seeing. The second thing I did was to look up those passages. John 8:31 through 47 is a passage in which Jesus was arguing with some of what the Gospel of John calls the Jews, without any differentiation or nuance, arguing about the inheritance of Abraham and the possibility that the Jews will try to kill Jesus. John 10:22 through 33 is a passage about the parents of a man blind from birth being afraid of, again, the Jews. That is actually the gospel reading in the lectionary this coming Sunday. Luke 12:11 is a saying of Jesus about his followers being brought before synagogues and rulers and authorities for persecution. Together, these three passages, and I assume also the ones underneath them hidden behind the man's leg, are a record of a very old, very predictable, and very blood-stained bit of Christian exegesis, the reading of the New Testament as a tract opposed to Jews and Judaism. What's somewhat newer, but also well established, is that anti-Semitic arguments place within a setting of public and overt white nationalist violence. We who have a stake in Christianity should pay attention to how easily hatred slides from the pages of the New Testament to the streets of white supremacist rallies and to all kinds of other places in between. Here's another photograph, this time one that someone took of their television screen on January 6, 2021. On that date, as you all know, a massed crowd stormed the United States Capitol building, inflicting violence on people and destruction on the building in an attempt to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. In the crowd that day, we have since learned, was a coalition of people from right-wing white nationalist organizations, members of the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, Women for America First, the Three Percenters, QAnon conspiracy theorists, and just regular people who were enamored by a narrative in which America was being seized from them, its rightful possessors, by a nebulous, diverse, woke, and activist left. This poster, framed by American and Trump flags and poised at the moment just before the crowd overran police barriers, cites three passages, one from the New Testament. Hebrews 4:12 is a violent metaphor of a verse. The word of God, it reads, is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing until it divides soul from spirit, joints from marrow. It is able to judge the thoughts and intentions of the heart. Here once more we have the New Testament and the Bible more generally front and center in a project of white nationalist violence. A third exhibit, this time not a photograph, but a manifesto that I know you probably can't read. The writing left behind by the man who murdered one person and injured three others at the Chabad of Poway Synagogue near San Diego, California in April 2019. This man begins his manifesto with a recitation of his European ancestry, claiming that, quote, the blood that runs in my veins is the same that ran through the English, Nordic, and Irish men of old. After a couple of paragraphs of that, he turns to some rhetorical questions. Quote, how does killing Jews help the European race? He asks. These Jews were innocent, he imagines someone objecting, but he answers, quote, every Jew is responsible for the meticulously planned genocide of the European race. Now, anyone who knows anything about white nationalism knows where this is going, and it only takes them another few paragraphs to get there. The writer cites Matthew 27:24 through 25, where Pilate washes his hands of Jesus' blood and the Jewish crowd chants, his blood be on us and on our children. Then he quotes John 8:37 through 45, that same part of the Gospel of John again that was cited on the poster in Charlottesville about who is heir to Abraham and the bloodthirstiness of the Jews. He lists 1 Thessalonians 2:14 through 16, which accuses Jews of killing Jesus, and then Revelation 2:9 and 3:9, both about the synagogue of Satan. He goes on in parts of this screenshot that I will not read out loud to quote the Skyrim video game, to go after African American people, the media, queer folks, and to call out to his, quote, brothers in blood to join his cause. On display here, I think, is a kind of manufactured paranoia about the place of whiteness in the midst of a changing world, aimed once more at Jews, but also everyone who is not white and heteronormative and frankly masculine, and rooted deeply, deeply in the pages of the New Testament. We'll come back to these examples in just a moment, but first a few words about the big picture. This evening, I want to talk about the ways the New Testament has been claimed and leveraged in white nationalist projects and in the project of white supremacy itself, and what kinds of structures and patterns that come from the ways the New Testament is researched and written about, how it's preached and studied, and how it is taught and learned. I want us to think about how the New Testament became white in a sense, how it became entangled in whiteness and embedded in white supremacy, and how we might begin to untangle it in our practices of scholarship and teaching and learning and preaching and study. I can imagine an objection right away. How someone might ask, how can the New Testament be racist? How can the New Testament be racist when it was written and compiled centuries before our modern conceptions and constructions of race emerged? How can the New Testament be racist when it was created in a time before our modern forms of race even really existed, or modern conceptions? Never mind the fact that the New Testament is a collection of writings that does not speak with one voice or hold one single viewpoint, racist or not. I'm reminded of a quote from a debate between candidates for the Florida governorship in 2016, when now disgraced Democratic candidate Andrew Gillum responded to suggestions that his opponent, Ron DeSantis, was a racist. Now, I'm not calling Mr. DeSantis a racist, Gillum said. I'm simply saying that the racists believe he's a racist. Something similar happens for the New Testament, I think. Apart from the question of whether the New Testament itself is racist, the racists think the New Testament is racist. White supremacists and white nationalists understand the New Testament as evidence for their positions. They see the Gospels and the letters of Paul and all the rest as artifacts of a struggle for European identity over and against a global majority. This is true despite the fact that, as some of the memes that float around the internet, like this one, sometimes put it, there are no white people in the Bible, at least if we are reckoning whiteness with the racial categories produced and maintained by 21st century Americans. Everyone we meet in the Bible, as another common internet meme puts it, everyone we meet in the Bible, including Jesus, would be pulled aside for a random screening by the TSA. So one of our starting points has to be what forms of biblical interpretation and what exercises of ideology have produced whiteness in a collection of texts that is so otherwise devoid of it. The story turns out to be complicated, and I want to start with an analogy. In 2017, the classicist Sarah Bond published an article in the web journal Hyperallergic called "Why We Need to Start Seeing Color in the Classical World." Bond's article focuses on statues like these, pieces of sculpture that have come down to us from the classical world and that now stand as examples of ideal beauty, as exemplars of the height of craftsmanship, and as artifacts of the origins of the things we call Western civilization and the Western tradition. As such, these kinds of statues are prized and privileged in the European imagination. As Bond puts it, quote, "Most museums and art history textbooks contain a predominantly neon white display of skin tone when it comes to classical statues and sarcophagi. This," she says, "has an impact on the way we view the antique world. We have come to equate beauty, classical beauty, aesthetic perfection with that neon white marble shine of sculpture. What scholars of classics know, though, is that this neon whiteness is an illusion. It is a falsehood. Much, if not most, ancient statuary was carved from marble or other stone and then painted, both to capture the effects of clothing and hair and all of that, and to capture the different shades of human skin that existed in just as much variety in the ancient world as they do in our world. I'll show one example here where the paint remains in a photo taken by Sarah Bond and published with her article that shows the way this particular artist attempted to capture the skin tone of this subject, an Egyptian man from the 2nd century. This example is a mummy mask, which means that it's both made of a material that held the pigment better than marble, and that it was buried in protected conditions in a hot and dry environment, which contributed to it being preserved. Here are a couple more examples that I saw in a museum in the Greek city of Corinth a few years ago to give you an idea of what color looks like on marble after a score of centuries. You can imagine how colorful they would have been when they were made. Scholars are able to determine by examining the trace pigments left in the stone that most ancient statues were decorated this way. And they only appear white to us today because of the passage of time, because the pigment has fallen or worn off, and because the academic disciplines that study these statues are centered in European geographies and in Eurocentric institutions with investments in whiteness. So by accident, we see whiteness where there never was whiteness. And more than that, on purpose, we turn that imaginary whiteness into an ideal of beauty. So, back to those signs from the Unite the Right rally and the January 6th insurrection and the Poway synagogue shooters manifesto. What's going on with the use of the New Testament in support of those acts of violence? How do those citations of anti-Jewish verses work, and how did they get there? Christianity cut its teeth in the othering and marginalization of Jews and Judaism. Judaism was the original other to Christianity. It was against Jews and Judaism that Christianity first began to define itself. To be a Christian, as early as people like Marcion and Tertullian and John Chrysostom were saying, to be a Christian was to not be Jewish. This pattern of othering Jews has changed and metastasized over the centuries so that it turned into other forms of ethnic othering and then racial othering that we'll turn to in a moment. So if you're looking for the roots of several diverse forms of modern prejudice and hatred, you could do worse than to go poking around in early Christian anti-Judaism. It's where Christians learned how to do it. So it's not surprising that white nationalists put anti-Jewish verses from the New Testament on their signs even today. Even if they might not quite know why they do it, there's a through line of logic and practice from Christian heresiology and exegesis to what happened in Charlottesville and on January 6th and in the ongoing acts of violence against Jews. So how does it work? How do those verses end up there on those signs and in that manifesto and on others like them? It's worth starting with the observation that most or maybe even all of the writings in the New Testament were written by Jewish people. The thing we call Christianity had its beginnings in Judaism as a movement within Second Temple Judaism, and most of the early figures in the Jewish movement were Jewish. Some scholars argue about whether the author of Luke and Acts might have been a Gentile, that is not Jewish. I don't know if Dr. Cobb brought that up when she was here. But I'm one who thinks that the author of Luke and Acts was in fact Jewish, and aside from that possible exception, the other New Testament authors are generally agreed to have been Jews. That means that when we hear the New Testament talking about the Jews or the Pharisees or the priests, we are witnessing an intramural debate. We are overhearing a conversation between and among Jewish people about what it might mean to be Jewish, what the shape of Jewish belonging might be. And we are hearing especially the dispute between those Jews who understood Jesus to have been important and those who did not. So when we read the New Testament, we are especially privy to that particular argument. Now, the problem arrives when we take the New Testament out of that ancient context and anachronistically think about it not as an intramural Jewish conversation, but as a dispute or a debate between Christians and Jews. The problem comes when we think about it as an interreligious instead of intra-religious collection. At that point, the Jewish authors' criticisms of other Jews turn into Christian criticisms of Jews, and they take on new and unintended meanings. When we do that, we read the New Testament authors as Christians in the modern sense, and we're making a historical mistake. We're also making a theological mistake, and both of those mistakes have consequences. So I want to give you an example from our own time and place. I'm going to pretend like I know the Presbyterian world better than I do. If you think about, you know more than I do, but when I think about the Presbyterian world, I'm aware that there are conflicts in the Presbyterian world over figures like John Calvin, over figures like Zwingli, over what it means to have been someone in the Reformed tradition, right? And in some ways, these are conflicts about the boundaries of community, who can belong, who can not belong. Sometimes this has to do with sexuality and gender, sometimes not. My mother lives very close to Montreat in North Carolina, which I always call the Presbyterian Rivendell, right? Because it's just this beautiful, idyllic space. But my understanding is the PCUSA owns the conference center and the PCA owns the college, and they share a campus, and they're constantly, going at each other. And I think part of the reason they're constantly going at each other is not that they're different, but that they're very much the same, right? That they have a lot in common. And so the things that are at stake in their differences become magnified because they're all Presbyterians, right? But they have these distinct disagreements over things like gender and sexuality and how to interpret things like the Book of Order, right? It's a dispute over tradition. So I think something like that is going on in the New Testament with the people who are called the Jews or the Pharisees and the people who are followers of Jesus. You could imagine sometime, 1,000 or 2,000 years from now, someone from, I'm just going to say the PCA, giving a sermon that gets preserved, and they're talking about the PCUSA, and they might say things detrimental or derogatory, right? I'm guessing they might. I don't really know. They would. And maybe vice versa. I don't know. But the mistake would be 2,000 years from now to take that as an objective perspective, right? And to not understand that it comes in the midst of a intramural conflict where there's actually more shared in common than there are differences. So you have to understand that nuance to really get why they would say those things about the PCUSA. The same is true in the New Testament. So when we read the New Testament's words about Jews and Judaism, we're reading one side of a very complicated and nuanced conversation and debate. We're reading a side of it that's inflected with a lot of anxiety and a lot of trauma and fights over possession. When we read, for example, in John 8:31 through 47, as you might read this coming Sunday, when Jesus is talking to a group of Jews who believe in him, by the way, these are Jews who believe in him, about what it means to be a descendant of Abraham, we cannot read it as a Christian talking about Jews. Jesus was not a Christian. Jesus was a Jew. And this is an intramural conversation. When we read John 10 that way, actually this is the one for Sunday. When we read John 10 that way, the man blind from birth and his parents were afraid of the Jews, we have to bear in mind that this is a passage written by a Jewish person about another Jewish person's interactions with a Jewish family in the context of a Jewish society. There are no Christians on the scene because Christians did not yet exist. I could go on, but you get the idea. When the Gospels talk about Jews and Jewish people, it's a serious mistake to read that as a no-context criticism of ancient Jews. It's absolute malpractice to read it as a criticism of Jews and Judaism anytime in the future, including in our own present. So when I was in seminary, I went to Vanderbilt Divinity School, and something happened while I was there that I don't think I'll ever forget. My professor there for my New Testament intro class was Amy Jo Levine. Some of you might know who she is. Very charismatic, wonderful teacher. And we were in this class, actually sort of looked like this room, a little bit, maybe a little bit steeper seating. And I think it was Holy Week because her kids were out of school. Their kids at this time were like 10 or 12 years old. And they were sitting in the top of the room, very bored, clearly bored. It was before you had phones and that kind of thing. So they were just sitting up there, bored out of their minds while Mom lectured. And at the end of the talk, she walked up to the top. She always teaches barefoot. She walked up barefoot to the top of the stairs. And she stood next to her son, and she put her hand on his head, and she said, "Look, I know a lot of you are training to be Christian ministers, and I know some of you are already in churches, and I know this Sunday is Easter, and the texts that we read out loud on Easter are texts that blame the Jews for the death of Jesus." She's standing there with her hand on his head, and she said, "When you get up and talk about these things, remember this boy, remember this kid, this little Jewish boy, and please don't ever say anything that would get him hurt." And to me, that's always been kind of like an ethical turning point, right? Where I stopped thinking about these texts as like the things that I should be able to proclaim because they're my religious texts, and I started thinking about them as ethical problems. Like, how do you preach a text like Easter or Palm Sunday, more to the point, where there are implications for the lives of people who are living in the world right now, who are going to get hurt when things like that get preached uncarefully. I added this image just today because I saw it on Twitter and I thought it was great. This is a flow chart for should I call this person a Pharisee? And I just think it's wonderful because Christians, we often slide into this language of terming our enemies Pharisees. It's likely in some 2,000 years from now, sermon that gets dug up, the PCA and the PCUSA are calling each other Pharisees because that's the way we talk about religious, what's the word I want? baselessness. It's the way we say someone is not religious in the right way. And we shouldn't do that. That's not something we should do. So anyway, I thought I'd add this in. So I want to move now to talking about another huge part of how the New Testament has come to be entangled in whiteness, and that has to do with race. I'm going to start with a story of the grandmother of Howard Thurman. Howard Thurman is a very famous scholar of religion from the middle of the 20th century. And he talks about, in one of his writings, his grandmother, whose name was Nancy Ambrose. Excuse me. And Nancy Ambrose, when Howard Thurman was a boy, Nancy Ambrose, the grandmother, was very old, and he had a bunch of things that he was supposed to do for her as a boy of maybe 8 or 10 years old. And one of them was to read to her because she had never learned how to read. And so he would sit and read to her all the time. Mostly she wanted to hear texts from the Bible. She wanted to hear all parts of the Bible. He read the whole Bible many times through, except she would not consent to hear anything from the Apostle Paul. And that was because she had been born enslaved on a plantation in Florida, and she had heard there Ephesians 6, which I know you can't make out, but this is Ephesians 6. This is the thing about slaves obey your masters. She had heard that preached to her there as a warrant for why she should be enslaved and why she should be obedient to her masters. We also have here, so Ephesians 6 is on the far side. There's also Colossians 3 and 1 Corinthians 7. These are all passages that talk about slavery and sort of work to naturalize it and make it something that people should accept as a part of their lot. And so Nancy Ambrose just refused to do it. She refused to hear any more from this guy, Paul. Once she was emancipated, she just didn't want to know anything more about him. And she would hear every part of the Bible but him. And so I think I've always thought of this as like the first act of interpretation is always what you choose to interpret. And it's okay to say no to things. So I had a student a number of years ago in my New Testament intros, Darrell Walker, who's sitting right out here, who called this the hermeneutic of hell no. And I think that's just great. I quoted this in a book, and I've started using it in all my classes. The hermeneutic of hell no, right? Because you can say no. Like when there's something that's harmful to you in the text, it's okay to say no. This is a newspaper clipping that I know you can't read from the October 30th, 1850 issue of the Weekly North Carolina Standard. And it's a sort of an opinion piece about the Fugitive Slave Act. Fugitive Slave Act is this piece of legislation that says no matter where you live, if you come across someone who has run away from slavery, you have this legal obligation to capture them and return them. And so citing this piece, citing Paul, and specifically citing Ephesians, they wrote, quote, "These Christians in the free states set up their judgments against that of the Almighty and blindly strike against all law, order, and right. Let them hear the language of St. Paul as he invokes the divine vengeance upon their evil deeds. We verily believe that the abolition ministers of the free states have done more harm in this matter than the whole northern population besides. Instead of subjecting themselves unto the higher powers, they are advising sedition and insurrection." So here are people making a case, explicit case, an argument for slavery using the writings of the New Testament. Notice at the top of the piece that they begin by making, you can't read it, but trust me, at the top of this piece, they begin their argument by making arguments about the depravity of Jews. That's not accidental. That's part of that through line of logic. This is how Christians learn to do it. Also in view here, Romans 13, which says, submit yourself to the ruling authorities. I don't think that's what it actually means, but that's a talk for another day. We'll talk more about that maybe in a little while. And Philemon, the book of Philemon, the shortest book in the New Testament, is also used in favor of the Fugitive Slave Act because the plot, insofar as there is a plot of that short letter, it's that Onesimus, it's a man named Onesimus, which means useful. He had been enslaved to the man Philemon, and Onesimus had run away and found Paul. And Paul sends Onesimus back to Philemon with the letter to try to mediate between the two. And so people who thought slavery was a good idea said, look, Paul's sending him back, this runaway slave there, he's sending him back. So it gets used in that kind of way. Just last week, I don't know if you saw this, just last week, was it somewhere in Texas, Texas Tech, The basketball coach got in trouble for citing Ephesians 6 to one of his players, slaves obey your masters. And it was his way of saying, you should be more coachable. Like, you should accept my coaching because I'm like your master in this situation. And you can guess the races of the people involved. But the Bible does weird stuff, right? It shows up in weird places in weird ways. And so you can kind of see how the logic of it makes its way into things. I found that one of the instincts of Christians, especially more liberal Christians, of which I think of myself as one of those, when presented with these kinds of passages that support slavery, is to say something like, well, those passages go against the overall message of the New Testament. Those passages like Ephesians 6 and Colossians 3 stick out because the New Testament as a whole is really about love. It's really arguing against and not for things that are oppressive like slavery. And my response to that is not really. That argument is not really entirely true, to say that those passages are out of step with the rest of the New Testament. To talk about what I mean by that, I want to talk for a second about kyriarchy in the language of the New Testament. So the prominent New Testament scholar Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza has articulated a way of talking about power that's very useful here. From a feminist perspective, she has described what she calls kyriarchy as a holistic way to talk about how power and domination work both in the ancient and modern worlds. Kyriarchy comes from two solid Greek New Testament words, kurios and arche, which mean lord and ruler or rule, respectively. Kyriarchy can be understood as an intersectional way of describing domination and power, including aspects like gender and ethnicity and social status, imperial belonging, colonization, wealth and poverty, and sexuality, among lots of other things. Kyriarchy is meant to describe a whole range of overlapping and intersecting ways of reckoning and negotiating power. I'm going to put this 17th century woodcut image up here so you have something to look at while I talk, and we'll get to this picture in a minute. It's surprising the degree to which early Christian theological language is the language of kyriarchy, and how easily that kyriarchical language lends itself to systems of oppressive power like slavery. It's remarkable how much the vocabulary of faith for early Jesus followers is layered on top of these kyriarchical systems and logics of domination. If we look at some of the top-line theological terms found in the New Testament, we see words and phrases like Lord and Master, servant and slave, Messiah and Christ, Son of God, King, Kingdom of God, Kingdom of Heaven, Good News. Every one of those words and phrases, even things like good news, which we can talk about later if you want, and others like them, are part of the vocabulary of first century kyriarchy, that is, power and domination. And every one of them is also part of the vocabulary of first century Jesus devotion, and therefore 21st century Jesus devotion. We don't have time to go through all the examples, so I'll start with the most obvious one, which is the word kurios, which is usually translated Lord. Like most words in most languages, kurios has multiple meanings depending on the context. And because modern translations into English are working behind the scenes to manage those meanings, to shield us from some of the implications of the text. So, for example, kurios can be translated simply as sir, as a term of respect for a man, as it's used in several times in the Gospel of John, such as in John 4 when the Samaritan woman at the well calls Jesus sir. She's saying kurios. And kurios is sometimes translated so that it refers to a householder or a head of household, as in Matthew 21 in the parable of the vineyard, when the kurios is translated to be the owner of the vineyard. And sometimes, and here's where things get a little difficult, sometimes kurios is translated as master, as the person who's in a position of domination over an enslaved person. This is the case, for example, in Jesus' saying in Matthew 6:24, where the NRSV says, "No one can serve two masters. A slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other." So here, the word kurios is referring explicitly to someone engaged in the domination of enslaved people. And of course, the most common way to translate kurios is as Lord, referring to Jesus, which probably reflects the Hebrew practice of using the word Adonai, Lord, instead of God's name or the word God. So that usage carries forward into the New Testament as a kind of divine title. Jesus' disciples, his other followers, and even strangers call him kurios, which is a way of addressing him with respect, but also a way of carrying all the resonance of a head of a household or a master or owner of enslaved people. There's a logic of domination and mastery embedded in the word, no matter which translation we choose. So let's turn then to another word on the list, a related word, the word doulos in Greek, and associated words like pais and paidiske. Doulos is always translated either slave or servant. Pais can be translated as child or slave, and paidiske can be translated as maidservant, servant girl, maid, or slave. Here's some homework. Go home after this. Maybe wait till tomorrow, it's going to be late. Go through your New Testament and look for uses of the word servant and slave in the text. It's going to show up about 150 times in the New Testament. Look for those uses and pay attention to how they show up and what ways the text is hiding the logic of slavery, because every time they show up, that's what's on the page, but sometimes it gets kind of tucked away. I think modern Bible translators probably correctly think that we don't want to read about slavery in our Bibles, and so they work hard to obscure slavery when it shows up in the text. But slavery is woven all through the New Testament, to the degree that it's actually hard to imagine the New Testament making much sense if you don't assume the practice of slavery and accept it as a structure of meaning-making for things like metaphors and parables and theologies. So, for example, in the parable of the wicked tenants, which is the image that's been up here this whole time while I've been talking, the vineyard owner sends his slaves to collect produce from tenants. The tenants beat one slave, kill another one, and stone another one. The vineyard owner, the kurios, in 2140, then sends more slaves, and the same thing happens to them, and eventually he sends his son, who's also killed. So this parable assumes, it's a parable right about Jesus and Jesus' death, but it assumes and depends on a system and logic of slavery to make this theological point. Sometimes the language of enslavement was used to make other more direct theological points. Paul was especially fond of this, which is probably why Nancy Ambrose was suspicious. See, for example, Romans 6:16 through 23, where Paul's talking about enslavement to sin. He talks about talks about sin as a form of slavery. Paul talks about himself as a slave. In Galatians 1:10, he calls himself a slave of Christ. Often that gets translated servant, but that's not what it means. Again, this can have a theological resonance as in Acts 4:29, when people are described as servants of God or servants or slaves of God or servants in the NRSV. In 1 Corinthians, when Paul says he's heard about the behavior of the Corinthians from, quote, Chloe's people, maybe you remember this. He's like, I've heard from Chloe's people that things are not going well. That probably meant her slaves. When Lydia and her household were baptized in Acts 16:15, it's a very triumphant story where this whole household of people is baptized. It probably meant Lydia and her slaves, who were obligated to do whatever she was doing. Since she was a dealer in purple cloth, likely she had a lot of slaves on an industrial scale. In Acts 12, when the maid Rhoda answered the gate, she was not a maid, but a slave. The logic of slavery shows up everywhere. So, I think we have to think through the implications of Christianity borrowing this word to refer to God and to Jesus, and borrowing the word master as a theological title, kurios, Lord. It's worth asking how the overlap between God language and domination language influenced the development of theology. How much does the structure of domination bleed over from Lord language to God language? Now, it's important to keep in mind ancient slavery was not the same as modern slavery. There's important differences between the two, including the fact that modern slavery in the Americas and the Caribbean was racialized, and the racialized practice of slavery created and reinforced racial categories that functioned like a caste system that are still with us today. In the ancient world, there could be ethnic logics to slavery, with certain groups of people being thought of as especially well-suited to enslavement, but it was not racialized in the same way and did not create a category of permanently enslaved people that was defined by physical characteristics like skin tone. That's an important difference to keep in mind. But another important difference between ancient and modern slavery is that modern slavery had the support of people who wrote about ancient slavery. Modern slavery had things like the Bible. that worked hard to naturalize slavery as a practice and even to make it an aspect of religious piety. So to return to the beginning of this section, when someone like Nancy Ambrose was skeptical of the Bible, or when slavery apologists turned to the New Testament to support their policies in the 1850s, that's because the New Testament and its logics of ancient slavery were understood to be a resource for and an argument for slavery in the modern period. The Christian tradition and its sacred text and its theological language set and its logics were all understood to be amenable to the practice of slavery. And it's not accidental that some of the most fervent Christianity was practiced in some of the most fervently pro-slavery parts of the United States. I want to show you briefly this book. I bought this at Iliff. There's a Student Senate book sale every year. And I bought this one there, and it's a book from the 1850s. It's a book of Methodist Sunday school notes. And what I really find interesting about it is this inscription on the front. It says, "Confiscated from the rebels by the Yankees in 1863, April the 30th." And so to me, it's a book of Sunday school lessons. And to me, this is just a reminder, of the role of religion as sort of a central part of the cause of defending slavery. This leads neatly into the next thing I want to talk about, which is conquest and colonialism. Here I want to start in the middle and then work both forward and backward. In 1852, Pope Nicholas V, that's this guy, issued a papal bull called Dum Diversas, also known as the Doctrine of Discovery. This papal bull was ratified and reaffirmed by several future popes, including in 1456 with the papal bull titled Inter Caetera by Pope Calixtus III. The basic message of these papal documents was this: European Christian powers could feel free to explore, conquer, and divvy up the world. And in fact, they should do that. And the people they encountered along the way should be reduced to servitude. Now, in case you think I'm being hyperbolic here, I've included here a section of the 1452 document translated into English. "We grant you, by these present documents," the Pope says, "with our apostolic authority, full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens," that is the Muslims, "and pagans, and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ, wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, duchies, counties, principalities, and other property, and to reduce their persons into perpetual servitude." Notice how deeply embedded the notion of servitude is in the logic of Christianity. That's kyriarchy doing its work. If we move forward from that time, we see the consequences of that papal document. The European colonizing powers did indeed invade, search out, capture, and subjugate large swaths of the world, the Americas, Africa, parts of Asia, and beyond, in a wave of colonialism that in many ways continues into our own day. It certainly continues in terms of its consequences for the world we live in. Our own presence right here, right now in the American West is a byproduct of the idea of manifest destiny, which was a Christian colonialist justification for settler colonialism and the seizure of land from native peoples. All around the world, the disruption of colonialism is still being felt. This 500-year-old Christian decision continues to reverberate for us today. If we go backwards from 1542, we can start to understand how the Christian tradition got to that point. Actually, this section goes backward and forwards, both backwards to the New Testament and the kinds of biases that might be written into it, and forward to our own time and how the New Testament is read and interpreted. So I've been working on the book of Acts lately, and I'm going to show you a couple of examples from that book of what I'm talking about, although there are other examples from elsewhere in the New Testament. The first of these examples comes in Acts 16:11 and 12, where Paul and his companions set sail from Troas on the western coast of what's now Turkey, and they make their way around the Aegean Sea to the city of Philippi. Here are these verses, just so you'll know what they say. "We set sail from Troas and took a straight course to Samothrace, the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. We remained in this city for some days." That's what it says. Scholarly readers of this text have had a field day with this geography. They have read a lot into this moment when Paul makes this particular journey. Can you see it yet? Doubt it, right? It doesn't really show up. So this scholar named Eric Barreto has helpfully collected a lot of these reactions. So I'm going to follow his work here in his book, Ethnic Negotiations, for a moment. Joseph Fitzmyer says about this journey from Troas to Philippi that, quote, God's summons was leading them to the evangelization of Europe. Luke Timothy Johnson calls this section, quote, the mission to Europe. James D.G. Dunn writes that this is, quote, how it was that Paul first brought the gospel to Europe. Charles Talbert speaks of Paul's, quote, Paul's divine commission for a European mission. Robert Wall speaks of, quote, the story of Paul's turn toward Europe. Margaret Williams of, quote, the first European missionary tour. Alan Paul Whitgren notes, quote, the significance of Philippi as the place where the gospel was first proclaimed in Europe, and Justo Gonzalez calls it, quote, the beginning of the mission in Europe. Barreto goes on to add more examples from more scholars, but you get the idea. Most, if not all scholars who comment on this passage make note of it as the moment when the gospel arrived in Europe, a kind of ta-da announcement moment where the gospel could be said to have reached a significant milestone. Indeed, when I traveled to Philippi several years ago, our tour guide sized up our group of mostly white Americans and launched into an energetic description of how we were standing in the very city where the gospel was first proclaimed in Europe. She was no doubt telling us what she was certain we would want to hear. So let's take a look at this dramatic mission to Europe. Here's a map of Paul's second missionary journey. This map shows the looping circular shape of Paul's journey, and the part of it in question in this passage is right up there at the top where they move from Troas to Philippi. A stone's skip across the sea, not a very long journey at all in the scheme of things. It was a very minor part of a much longer journey, certainly not warranting the attention commentaries have paid to it. And the biblical text itself does not really take note of this passage from Asia into Europe. It does not dwell on this as the moment when the gospel first moved into Europe. And in fact, the biblical text does not mention Europe at all, probably because the biblical authors and the characters in the story were unaware that they had passed from Asia into Europe. They did not have maps and navigational knowledge that allowed them to understand continents in our modern sense. To them, as some modern scholars have pointed out, they were simply sailing around the Aegean Sea, hugging the coastline for safety, and they would not have known or understood that they had made any geographical shift at all. It's only when we layer Eurocentrism onto the text in Acts 16, 11, and 12 that we have anything to do with Europe. It might not be surprising that scholars of mostly European ancestry trained in Eurocentric institutions in a field dominated by European self-regard would turn this short sea journey into a dramatic mission to Europe. But even if it's not surprising, it is significant because it reveals something of the biases of the field. Here's another example from the book of Acts, this one from a little earlier in the book in chapter 8. In Acts 8, we find a strange story, one that's very rich with interpretive possibilities. An angel found the apostle Philip and told him to go south to the road that leads from Jerusalem to Gaza through a wilderness. So Philip went, and when he got there, he saw a chariot driving down the road, and in the chariot was a person described this way. Now there was an Ethiopian eunuch, the text says, a court official of the Candace, queen of Ethiopians, in charge of the entire treasury. I've put a woodcut by an unknown author up here to illustrate the scene, but also to illustrate some of the problems with the interpretation of this scene. This Ethiopian eunuch had been to Jerusalem to worship, and he was beginning the journey home, seated in the chariot, reading from the prophet Isaiah. Philip was commanded to go over to the chariot, which he did, and Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch had a conversation about the interpretation of the Isaiah text, about Jesus, about baptism. When they began to talk about baptism, some water appeared alongside this desert road, and Philip baptized the Ethiopian eunuch before being, quote, snatched away by the Spirit of the Lord and taken to another place. This is a very strange story in a lot of ways. I love it. It's great. But in a 1989 article, Clarice Martin pointed out that one of the strangest things about this story is the way that readers of this passage talk about the Ethiopian eunuch. Martin highlights some of the interpretive strategies that readers of this story adopt. One of these is what she calls uncertainty. Essentially, Martin finds many scholars read this passage about a person described in the text as an Ethiopian and conclude that we simply cannot know anything for certain about whether they were an Ethiopian. She quotes one scholar as saying that the Ethiopians' quote, ethnic origin is strictly undetermined. The same is true for skin tone. Even when the Ethiopian is acknowledged as an Ethiopian, scholars resist the implication that to be Ethiopian means anything particular about skin. Martin quotes a scholar who writes, quote, "It is quite possible that the Ethiopian eunuch was black, but that is never said." And anyway, the same scholar goes on to say, in this story, quote, "The question of nationality has no special importance." Here, scholars seem to be laboring hard to find ambiguity in a story full of very precise descriptions. They are reading a story about a person described as an Ethiopian and concluding, well, we can't know for sure whether they are an Ethiopian, and certainly we can't know for sure whether Ethiopians were black. The artist who made this woodcut seems to have thought the same thing. This is a very white Ethiopian. In case you're wondering to yourself, well, maybe Ethiopian meant something different in the ancient world. No. There was actually a saying. We would think of it as a racist saying today, probably, but it was a common saying in the Roman Empire to clean something really thoroughly was to wash an Ethiopian white, right? So they knew what Ethiopians looked like, right? And actually, if anything, Ethiopia in the ancient world was shifted a little further south. It was closer to Sudan than it is to modern Ethiopia. So it's an Ethiopian. This is all connected to what Clarice Martin calls, quote, the politics of omission. Martin notes that the New Testament itself, and I would add Acts in particular, displays a kind of directional shift. You can actually see it in this map that I showed you a second ago, right? It's shifting directions toward the west. It follows a movement away from places and people centered in the southern and eastern Mediterranean and toward people in places centered on the northern and western Mediterranean. It moves, the New Testament does, in other words, from talking about places like Egypt and Judea and Syria to places like Macedonia and Rome. So the New Testament itself moves in that direction, and it allows readers of the New Testament to move their attention accordingly. There's also a politics of omission in the way that modern scholars and other readers of the biblical text focus on those northern and western geographies, putting more importance on the people and places that are more associated with modern European identity and less on people and places that are not. An example of how these two politics of omission come together in a concrete way is this map of the background of the New Testament, found in the Oxford NRSV Study Bible, a very fine study Bible. In this map, substantial portions of the Black Sea region, the region of Europe north of the Danube River, and Armenia are included as background of the New Testament. That's the title of this map, background of the New Testament. While Ethiopia is cut off at the bottom, even though Ethiopia is clearly part of the background of the New Testament, as we know because we've just been talking about a text in which it is part of the background. But just as egregiously, North Africa itself is erased, not by the choice of where to crop the map, but by a series of 3 other maps overlaid onto it. They reproduce Paul's journeys through Asia Minor and Greece, and the 3 journeys are set right on top of Egypt, Libya, Cyrenaica, and swaths of the Carthaginian Empire. They just put them right on top of that, as if North Africa wasn't there. Gay Byron summarizes this kind of move well when she takes note of how scholars have decided that references to Africa and Africans, which can be found with some regularity in the New Testament, are too, quote, sporadic or inconsequential for understanding the development of early Christianity. So, I started off by talking about how early Christianity made others out of Jews and Judaism, and as we've gone along, I've talked about how Christianity made new others along the way. So before I turn to a conclusion, I want to spend a moment, pointing out how these same old patterns are still creating new others for Christians. In 2018, Immigration and Customs Enforcement began to implement more severe policies at the southern border, including separation of children from their parents into separate detention facilities and a so-called zero-tolerance effort. This effort officially lasted from April to June 2018, although instances of family separation have been reported both before and after that time. 5 years after this policy began, we have a very clear picture of just what a bad idea this was. It led to about 5,500 children being separated from their parents, some of which still have not been reunited, and to waves of diagnoses of post-traumatic stress and other impacts among both children and parents. It has been extraordinarily traumatic, and in my opinion, it's one of the great national shames of our time, And in case you think I'm blaming the former president, it sounds like we're going to do something similar with the current president too. What's most interesting from the perspective of the study of the New Testament is how the New Testament showed up in this debate over the family separation policy. In an interview about the policy, the Attorney General at the time, Jeff Sessions, said this, quote, "I would cite to you the Apostle Paul and his clear and wise command in Romans 13 to obey the laws of government because God has ordained them for his purposes." He continued, quote, "Orderly and lawful processes are good in themselves and protect the weak and lawful." Later on, the White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders said, quote, "It is very biblical to enforce the law." Although this is from a separate incident, from a moment not coincidentally when this president was trying to quell protests after the murder of George Floyd, protests that were taking place as part of the Black Lives Matter movement, I think this photograph sums things up really well. It reveals the logic of the Bible being recruited into moments when power was trying to reinforce itself against people of color. You can almost hear Sarah Huckabee Sanders' words about the family separation policy here in this photograph. It is very biblical to enforce the law. So I have spent almost all of our time on the first half of the title, How the New Testament Became White. And so now in the final couple minutes, I'll turn to the second half, How to Read It Differently. It's a very short section. I would suggest a few things to help us read the New Testament and indeed the whole Bible differently, none of which are especially revolutionary or even satisfying on their own, but all of which I think are necessary. First, we have to recognize how the Bible is being used. It can be easy to think of the New Testament as a purely religious document, something that belongs in church and nowhere else. But as we have seen, that is not true. The Bible shows up in all kinds of spaces and all kinds of conversations where we might not have expected it, all the way down to basketball coaching. It can be easy, especially for more liberal or progressive folks, it can be easy to write off the Bible as something only conservative Christians would cite or quote or use simply because those are some of the loudest voices, citing or quoting and using it. But I remain convinced that the Bible is one of the most powerful rhetorical tools in existence in the world today. There are something like 2 billion Christians in the world, and many of them will listen when they hear that the Bible says something. We have to pay attention to how the Bible is being used and in what forums and to what ends. And when we see it being used for injustice and oppression in the past or in the present, we have to be willing to recognize it and to oppose it. Part of this, I think, is this hermeneutic of hell no. It's this resisting the urge to let the Bible off the hook. When the Bible is cited to support slavery or domination or marginalization, or of course, when the Bible is cited to support outright white nationalist violence, there's a tendency to excuse that away and say that it's an illegitimate use of Scripture. We find ourselves saying that the people putting gospel verses on anti-Jewish signs or in hateful manifestos are using the New Testament wrong. We like to say that the message of the New Testament is really all about love. But that, besides not really being true, that I think is a way of ignoring the problem. It's a way of denying the real harm that the Bible has done and continues to do. Instead of explaining away interpretations that we don't like or attributing them to bad actors, we have to be willing to claim them. We have to be willing to claim our own histories and our own interpretive practices, and then to renounce them and turn away from them and move toward better interpretations, better and more just ways of making meaning out of the text. It's not true to say that the Bible doesn't support slavery or settler colonialism or anti-Judaism or other forms of oppression. It does. It has been used that way, historically, objectively. It's not enough to say that the Bible should not have supported those things. We have to acknowledge that those things are in the Bible, that Christians have read the Bible that way, and then to denounce them and build new ways of reading and interpreting Scripture that produce justice in the world and not hatred and oppression. We have to learn those ways and teach them and preach them and respond to them and to take them into hand when we see hatred in the world, throw them in the faces of white nationalists and modern-day Kyriarchs and colonialists. We have to leverage the Bible as the powerful tool that it is, owning it for all of its flaws and pushing it to be better than it has been. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Eric, so much. We're going to open it up for question and answers, and I know that I have many going through my head right now, but I want to open it up for you all. Is there a question that we can start out?
And the folks on YouTube can type them in, right? So
Yes, those on YouTube, and Kate, you're monitoring those if questions come in on YouTube. That's great.
I need a clarification on someone you cited, Elizabeth Schlosser.
Schussler, Schussler, and the U has an umlaut. And then Fiorenza, Fiorenza.
Okay.
If you Google her, you'll find a lot of stuff. She's,
Okay. So I'll read a lot of, sorry, her name just left me. Episcopalian.
Spong? Or not that one?
Barbara Brown Taylor.
Okay, better.
Her book, Holy Envy. I adore that book. And this is my thinking of why we're such a white Christian nation originally. It's because the Europeans had better boats. What if Muslim nations were able to get over here and they explored? We wouldn't be predominantly the skin color and the religious leanings. What if North Africa had, the people who live there had better boats? Am I way off base in thinking that it's just because they got here first?
So I think that's true, right? That in some ways, like, accidents of history have determined some of these, the way some of these things have unfolded. And if Islamic people had colonized the Americas, we might well be hanging out here speaking Arabic and talking about the ways that the Quran has been employed for religious oppression and things like that. For me, as a person of European descent and as a Christian, this, I wouldn't own that, but I do have to own this, right? This is my tradition, this is my sacred text, and it's my, in many ways, my people who have made a mess of things. And so I would hope, in that alternate timeline, that those people would be owning that too. But in this one, I think it's, especially Christian institutions have to reckon with the role that Christianity has historically played.
Okay, thanks.
All the way in the front down here. Get a workout tonight.
Hi, so I was actually wondering, you talked about reading the New Testament in recognizing its racist and anti-Semitic and overall oppressive backgrounds. How could we use those parts of the Bible that are supporting this, which becomes terrorism, as a way against it? How do we twist, because they're still there. They're going to use it no matter what, no matter how many other citations we use. So how do we twist, or how do we look at them in a different way that creates the feeling that I believe that Christianity, or that I'm guessing that we believe Christianity is?
That's a really great question and a really big question. I would frame it as a question of biblical authority. So what do we think the Bible is for, and what does it do, right? Which is a very big question. And so if you have a view of the Bible as always right, which some Christians do, and infallible, right? This is the Word of God and there's nothing else to say about it, then I think it's very difficult to do what you're asking, right? How do we turn this toward the good, toward justice? But I think if you think of the Bible as something closer to what I might think of it as, which is a collection of stories about people's journeys through their lives, their struggles with their God, trying to make their way in the world. And we view it as, a set of examples, some of which are positive, some of which are negative, some of which are instructive because it's a good way to act, and some of which are instructive because we shouldn't be that way. Then I think we can view the Bible as a way to make sense of the world we live in, right? So these people, in Genesis or in the Gospel of Luke or whatever, they didn't live in the same world as us. They didn't have climate change. They didn't have January 6th. There's a lot of things going on in our world that don't show up in the Bible. And so I think that's how we read it, right? Is we take the principles we can derive from them and say, here's a way for us to live. And part of that has to be the negative example, to say, the Bible shows us things. I think this is obvious, but a lot of people don't. I think the Bible shows us things that are not good, To me, that's self-evident, but not everything in the Bible is exemplary. And so we have to be able to say that out loud and to say, sometimes things are in there that we should not follow. The example that comes to mind, I think you're too young to have lived through this, but I was in seminary when 9/11 happened. And this friend of mine, her name was Holly, it was her first Sunday preaching. You know how you get seminarians and they preach their first sermon Sunday after 9/11. And the lectionary, I don't know if you remember this, the lectionary had that psalm in it where it says, I want to take the children of my enemies and bash their heads against the rocks. That's in the Bible, right? So, and a lot of people felt that way in the wake of 9/11. That's how it was a hard time. And so she stands up and preaches this sermon where she says, yes, it feels that way sometimes. Like the Bible's telling us the way sometimes we feel, and it's not telling us to go and do it. It's telling us that's how it feels, and we're meant to do better than that. Vengeance is not the only way. So I think there's a pathway to taking those things that the Bible has in it and turning them toward a better world. I hope there is.
Another question?
For the people on YouTube, yeah.
Hello. And my brother, who moved here from Atlanta, has started participating. And every day he challenges the host, who is a pastor and a friend of mine, who is an elder in the United Methodist Church. He challenges him about the Bible. And he says, I believe in God, but I don't believe what's in the Bible because of how it treats black people and how we are, as slavery and other issues that are not good for black people. So now I'm going to go back tonight and call him and say he has been redeemed. It's all right for him to do that, because I've been a little afraid, because one person is, she's like a Pentecostal person who's on there, and she believes deeply in the Bible. And I'm afraid that my brother is offending people, but it looks like he's on the right track. So thank you. I'll let him know, and I'll give him your information. He may call you.
All right. Thank you. If I may make a book suggestion, there's a book called The Genesis of Liberation. It came out maybe 5 years ago, and that book was written by Robert Sadler and Emerson Powery, who are a couple of Bible scholars. And the book is about, the subtitle is something like, I'm not going to get it right, but anyway, the book's about the writings of people who escaped from slavery and wrote their memoirs. So the most prominent of these is the one that 12 Years a Slave was based on. But there's a bunch of them. And these folks often take up the question of biblical interpretation because they've wrestled with just this question. They heard people say to them, here's what the Bible says about why you should be enslaved. And they none of them had been to seminary, right? A lot of them taught themselves to read by reading the Bible. And what they came up with more often than not was like these really subversive ways to read the text that undermined. There's a trope called the master's minister, right? The master would bring in a minister to preach to the enslaved folks. And so these folks were coming up with these counter examples of how to interpret Scripture that actually was preaching liberation. So it's a great book that kind of resurfaces the voices of people often from the 1840s, 1850s to do, I think, what it sounds like might be going on in that 7:30 in the morning study. Who's that elder? I want to know. Who's the Methodist elder? Which one? Which one's the Methodist elder? I'm curious.
His name is Elder King Harris.
Okay. Yeah.
Her father.
All right.
That's why she's pointing.
I was just trying to figure. I know a lot of Methodists, so I was trying to figure out if it's somebody I know.
Thanks, Sylvia. I just want to say that I think the interpretation of everything is based on who's reading it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And these interpretations, you know, how the New Testament became white, it's just the same way that we have decided to embrace the Bible, those who have,
Mm-hmm.
or others have decided to embrace the religions that they practice.
Mm.
And it's the ones who don't practice in that way that have judgment about whether or not they should practice other religions, or judgments about how the interpretations are. But, you know, throughout time, just like you're saying, I mean, the experience is from where you are, right? So they had to use the word to enslave people. And those people who were enslaved at that time, and the people who do not take risks to ask about the passages in the Bible, they came from a whole other experience. And that experience had nothing to do with this Bible. And so if they are being told this through words that they were not being able to read, that's just another way of enforcing the oppression that were on these people. And it continues through time. Because the more that you do not allow people to read, or the more that people feel that their privilege is being challenged, the more they have to find things to degrade or put down others. And because this, as you spoke about, we spoke about it through art, but it's not necessarily, you know, I agree with you from the perspective of this place called Europe, that by that map they made up. There's this sense of this is what beauty is, because there has always been the conversation of what beauty wasn't. So the separation of individuals and the separation of someone being unlike oneself is I guess the degrading point of why passages from anything continues to separate people. And I guess to the point of how do we not do this, I guess that question was kind of brought up. You just decide not to do it. The way people decide they're going to be engaged with the book or not be engaged with the book, and in which way. Because as a child growing up, I never wanted to read or have anyone read anything to me from the Bible, because it was destructive and scary, and everything was going to come to an end in any second. Right? And that was my child's voice. But I've gone to church my whole life. But it's not this sense of, I don't go to one place because I believe, like, it's just my belief that we all come to it from different perspectives. And the uncertainty that people have about, I'm going to say this again, their own privilege, is why religions continue to split. People decide to move to different places. The churches or the denominations become more vast because our human self needs to be right. And those passages, as the pictures that you show, are the things that make those people believe they're right.
That's really well said. As you were talking about the individuals coming up with their own perspectives and that sometimes leading to division, right? I think that's really true. Like we can take the fact that we all read the Bible differently from different perspectives, and we can say, well, that should then divide us, and we should go off into our different corners. Or we can take it and say, well, this is a gift of the Holy Spirit. This is Pentecost, right? Like this is the thing that happens as we have different understandings and we bring them together into the same space, and that's actually what the Spirit looks like. And so it's better to be together and be working these things out together. Yeah.
Then we would unite more than we would separate.
That's right. Yep.
So it's all right to have these disagreements in our morning devotional? Is that what you're telling us? All these different...
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think disagreements over interpretation, listen, why does Jesus teach in parables, right? A parable is a really bad way to communicate information. It's never clear what it means. And I think he did it for that reason, so we'd argued about it. I think it's holy to argue over things.
One more? All right.
So I want to add on to what was said about the enslavers using words that the enslaved could not interpret for themselves. In Malcolm X's autobiography on page, I believe it's 309, paragraph 1, and I'm not going to get the quote correct, but the summarization is that those who have the reason that the enslaver does not educate the enslaved is because the moment that he does, the enslaved is no longer afraid of the enslaver. And what I wonder for using the Bible is if it is if it is more of an attack of insecurity, using something that you grew up learning, that you are safe and protected in, if they're weaponizing this, what they know to be truth to them, to simply attack others since they feel insecure or since they feel questioning of their beliefs, of their religion, of everything that they knew, and they use what they do know, which is spelled out inside the Bible and the New Testament in specific, if that's just...
Yeah, I think I would go back to something I said somewhere in there, which is just that this is a really powerful thing, the Bible. It has a lot of cultural power. People listen when you say the Bible says. And so I think that's why it was used in support of slavery, and that's why it was used against slavery. And that's why there's so much at stake in the interpretation of it, right? Because it is kind of a powerful lever that we can move things with. And I think that's why it's important to push on it, you know? It's not surprising maybe that the people who had the Bible thrown at them as a tool of oppression in lots of different ways would then seize it and say, this is my tool now, and I'm going to use it for my own liberation. I think that's the way it ought to be, and it's a wise strategy. I'm impressed with your ability to quote chapter and verse of biographies. That's impressive.
I was thinking, Eric, that about the quote from Mark Twain that he might say in religion, but I'm going to use it in the Bible. The Bible is like a medicine chest. Inside of it is both poison and cure, and so that we have to know it in order to undermine the oppressive pieces. You have to know the liberative pieces as well. I mean, in feminist interpretation, the same way. There's lots of oppressive text, and yet the text has a way of undermining it. It's wrestling. It's always self-correcting, but we have to know it. And what I think we do, particularly as liberals, is we go, well, we're not them, so we're not going to engage in it. Like they have co-opted it, so we want to just stay away from it. But that's why we're doing New Testament series for 8 or 9 weeks, because we have to know the text. Yeah. We have to be in it. So I'm so grateful for you being here and adding this dimension to our interpretation and in the interpretive work that we're learning about in a New Testament series, but it has been incredibly rich so far, and we still have 2 more weeks in this series, 2 more Sundays. Eric, thank you so much for being here. Very much. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight, and for those on live stream, we know that you've been joining us. For any of you who are guests tonight, super glad you're here. And come on Sundays, the next 2 Sundays, we have Dr. Pam Eisenbaum, who will be teaching about Paul. Paul was not a Christian, is her topic this Sunday. And Pam is Jewish and a New Testament scholar like Amy Jill Levine. So these wonderful Jewish scholars interpreting the New Testament, which is great. Anyway, be well, go in peace.